Good evening all, and welcome. Tonight we're going to be heading to the cemetery, and I have the pleasure of being joined by my friend Papa Scare. But without further ado, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I live less than half a mile away from a densely wooded area with an 1800s era graveyard which I frequently go to, mainly looking for mushrooms and reptiles, but the past few times I've been, and the very last time I went, have been exceptionally strange. I'll start with the most interesting thing to happen first. I had gone to this graveyard roughly around 2 p.m. again looking for mushrooms, and was roughly 400 feet into the woods, much past the graveyard, which is only about 20 to 30 feet from the entrance, when I decided to head home. I began walking back towards the way I'd entered, when I started getting the feeling that I was being watched. Now, being in the woods, that's quite a normal thing. It usually just ends up being an owl or deer. However, I quickly realized it probably wasn't, when I finally got back to the area of the graveyard and the woods went dead silent, which isn't a good thing. So I ran pretty quickly out of there. The moment I stepped out, I looked to the right of me and saw a trail that I hadn't seen before, so I quite stupidly decided to go into the trail to see what was back there, and there wasn't much, just rusted cans and trash. I had stood back in this area where the short trail took me when I heard a very strange sounded deed. It sounded almost like a frog, but very high-pitched and almost tonal, like someone singing, that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. At this point I sprinted out of the woods until I was nearly back at my neighborhood when I looked back, and when I did, there were 3 small orbs that seemed to stare back at me. At that moment I just said to myself, "Screw this," and ran as fast as I could back into my neighborhood. The only other strange thing to happen back there are the Sasquatch trees, which are bent over, and I know for certain no human could have bent. The trees, bent back, are over 20 feet in height and very sturdy. And the time when I was back in the graveyard with my mother, we both heard a distinctive whoop, like the stereotypical sound you hear on the Bigfoot documentaries, which were very strange. When I was 5, we used to visit the cemetery and place flowers on relatives' graves. We also drove by the cemetery on a regular basis. As explained by my mum, one day we were driving by, and I said next time we went to the cemetery, I wanted to take Frank some flowers. My mum asked who Frank was, and I pointed to an above-ground 2-person crypt and said Frank was there. My mum turned around and drove back to the entrance and went to the crypt, and there was a man named Frank entombed there. This apparently went on for a number of years, and one day we drove by, and my mum asked me why I didn't mention Frank needing flowers, as I did every time we drove by. My response was, because Frank wasn't alone anymore, so we didn't need to take him flowers. Mum whipped the car around and drove to the crypt, and there was a new marker on the other side. Frank's wife had died a few months earlier, and he was not alone anymore. I vaguely remember the Frank episode, but not whatever feelings I had to know Frank was there, or why I knew his wife had died. It freaked my mum and sister out for a very long time though.
This incident happened in 1994 when I was 17 years old. My friends and I, 5 guys and 4 girls, decided to pay a visit to Lim Chu Kang Muslim Cemetery. We were on an open pickup driven by one of my friends. Upon arrival at the cemetery at about 11 p.m, the place was very quiet, with only the sounds of crickets and gusty wind filling the air. The place was quite dark, and the moonlight was the only source of light we had, as we had turned off the pickup headlights. We then started our little adventure, and when we were somewhere in the middle of the cemetery, we suddenly heard the sound of crows cawing. We were feeling eerie at that point of time, when suddenly the cawing sound changed into the sound of a baby crying. Upon looking around, I spotted that we were near to children's graves, We then decided to leave the area and proceeded to another location. As we were passing by a lane, we then spotted a Malay grave with the earth in the center of the grave glowing in red. It looked like volcano lava. We then heard a faint sound of humans screaming in pain. At that point of time, I say enough is enough. We then decided to leave the cemetery as we felt that we were disturbing the dead, resting in peace.
This happened when I went to my grandfather-in-law's cemetery. I had just gotten into my first huge ever fight with my husband. His grandpa became my father figure in the short time he was in my life, so I went to his grave and talked to him and told him I was upset and why and that I needed help. Our family tradition is to always clean it up, the whole thing. We tend to bring small plastic shopping bags or trash bags with us to put the trash in. While I'm alone, I headed towards the section and bent over a soldier's grave, and as I was cleaning it, I suddenly felt like I was being watched by something evil or negative. I stood up and quickly looked around. Mind you, where his cemetery is, there's nothing but cow fields on 3 or 4 of the sides. It's so open. Well, one has woods and goes to a person's property. It felt like whatever it was in the woods, but there's nothing there, not even a squirrel. I went back to work on the soldier's grave and suddenly hear the wind pick up and something run at me from the woods. I spun around quickly and literally felt someone grabbing my shoulder and telling me everything was going to be okay, and like I was in some kind of force field or bubble, and that I was going to keep going. But the voice said, "I can't hold this much longer, you have to leave." I'm running back to my car at this point. I get in, lock the door, and turn on my Pandora, and it literally glitched down the playlist to turn on Blackpink's song "See You Later." My grandpa-in-law never said goodbye, but always, "I'll see you later." Didn't matter if it was on the phone or in person. I sped home and told my husband. It never happened again, and outside of one person and my husband, no one believes me that it happened. Never have I had weird feelings like that again from this cemetery either. We do still clean it. We just cleaned it back in October, after my mother-in-law's funeral was over. My husband's family thought we were weird. Others said that we're super nice for doing that. When I was 15, I went to Virginia with my mum and dad to see one of my sisters. She was in the Navy and stationed in Norfolk. She had a baby a few months prior and we went to meet her. Because we were in Virginia and I was fascinated with history, I wanted to visit the historic town of Jamestown and Williamsburg. So the second day we were there, we went to Williamsburg. My sister told us about one of the churches where the founding fathers would sit, and I wanted to go in. It was very neat and nicely air-conditioned. After we left the church, there were gravestones that my mum and I went to look at. While we were standing there, I started feeling a tightness around my neck. The tightness kept intensifying. It felt like I was going to suffocate. I looked at my mum, who looked like the wind was knocked out of her. She eventually manages to push me and I grab her, and we both manage to break free of whatever the hell that was. After we catch our collective breath, she notices I have redness around my neck, and when she takes a closer look, she sees a full handprint. She takes a picture and shows me. It's a handprint, a very large one, and also proceeds to take a picture with my hand over the handprint, and the handprint is so much larger I can't match it. When my dad and brother-in-law come over, my dad immediately asks why I have redness on my neck. I tell him, but he doesn't believe me. Not only do I put my hand over the handprint to show him, he does the same thing and his hand is even smaller. He, of course, tells me and my mum nothing happened, and we proceed to leave. My mum takes a quick snapshot of the graveyard before we do, and when we look back at the photos, we notice a silhouette by a tree that was near the gravestone where we were looking at. Mind you, this was in broad daylight. After a few days, when we get back home to show my older sister the picture, she believes us, and was the only one as my brothers didn't. A day after, we settle my mum, download the pictures on the computer, and went to look at them. Those pictures of my neck around the graveyard were completely gone. My mum's camera at the time held photos for 2 weeks before then permanently deleting them. When we went back to look to see the pictures on her camera, at that point 6 days later, they were also gone. She tried to download the pictures again, but they were permanently lost. They're just memories now, but when I tell people, most think it's a made-up ghost story. But I, for one, can tell you with certainty that all of this was true and really happened.
A little backstory. I've always been interested in the paranormal. When I was in my younger 20s, I had heard from a high school friend that she was possessed at the local cemetery and had witnesses. I decided to check it out during witching hours a couple of nights later with a friend. This story isn't nearly as interesting as all of yours, but it definitely gave me goosebumps. We got to the cemetery around 2:30 a.m. and began walking around, first to the tombstone where the possession happened, which is the oldest part of the cemetery, but nothing happened. We walked around to various other places, including a massive statue of an angel, like 15 feet high, and got the heebie-jeebies. Nothing unusual. This cemetery is fairly large, and after this section, we had one more we wanted to check out before we went home. At this time, it was probably roughly 3:30 to 3:45. We approached the final section we wanted to check, slightly disappointed. This section is nearly the woodline, for context. As we approach, we start to hear noises over by the woodline. Figured it is probably a rodent or something. Nothing unusual, but we check it out anyway and didn't find anything. Disappointed yet again, we turned to leave. I pass the grave of a soldier that died a long time ago. As I pass, I hear leaves crunching behind me, and my shirt is pulled back to the point it stretched across my chest. Obviously at this point I'm freaking out. I turn around to see if a tree branch could have gotten me, but the only branch near me was about 6 feet above my head. I told my friend, and he said he didn't notice anything. I was in the Marine Reserves at the time. I feel the soldier knew that, and that's why it reached out. Nothing else happened after that, and we left. Like I said, nothing crazy, but that's my 2 cents.
This story takes place in 2010, when I was first in high school. I worked at the movie theater in town. It was an awesome first job. Free popcorn, soda, candy, and I got to watch movies whenever I wanted. The owners would even let me bring my friends in after hours to watch movies or play games on the big screen. It was pretty normal for my friends to drive around town and randomly stop by the theater if they knew I was working. Not much else to do in a small town. 2 of my friends, Taylor and Justin, stopped by and hung out in the lobby with me while we waited for a movie to end. Taylor told me that he had heard a rumor of some weird lights out the old cemetery just outside of town. Now, Taylor was a pathological liar, so I doubted almost everything that came out of his mouth. But Justin surprisingly started backing up what he was saying. So I told him that as soon as I finished clearing up after the theater, I'd close and drive out to the cemetery with them. The late screening finished. I cleaned the theater and locked up at around 1 a.m. I honestly had no idea what to expect, so I told them I'd drive. At the time I drove my dad's F-150 Ford pickup truck, so the 3 of us squeezed into the front seat as they directed me out to the cemetery. I thought for sure they were messing with me, but after about 20 minutes of driving on old country roads, we came up to a bridge, which was at the bottom of a hill. The bridge was surrounded by woods, and the cemetery was at the top of the hill. The bridge looked super old, and I wasn't sure if it would hold the weight of the truck, so I parked the truck right in front of the bridge. Taylor told me to turn the truck off, and he said he was getting out. At this point, I didn't really trust Taylor, so I was also freaked out because we were at a cemetery at 2 a.m. and told them I was staying in the truck. They caved and stayed in the truck with me. About 5 or so minutes passed, and we started to see fireflies. It was so dark and clear out that we couldn't even see them in the woods around us. I asked Taylor if those were the lights he saw, but before he could answer, he pointed to the top of the hill, and I saw a giant blue light. Once I looked at this blue light atop of the hill, several others popped up in the woods around us and then moved up the actual cemetery. The lights looked like they were blinking, but this could have also been from moving around in the woods while the trees were blocking their light. I started freaking out and was screaming at both of them and told them that if they were playing a prank on me, I was leaving and it wasn't funny. I tried starting the truck, but it turned on once, then died. Taylor had a shocked look on his face, which only made me more anxious. At this point I was crying, borderline hysterical, and kept pumping the gas while turning the key. I didn't look up. I didn't want to. Finally, after what felt like forever, the truck started. I looked up and saw that the blue light at the top of the hill was now in the middle of the bridge, and had taken the shape of a torso. I had no clue what was happening, but I just started to have a really bad feeling and knew I needed to get the hell out of there. Taylor was yelling at me to stay there, that he wanted a better view of this thing, but I wasn't listening. I was shaking as I threw the truck into reverse and sped back the way we came. We were quiet the whole way back to the theatre. I dropped Taylor and Justin off at their car and drove home. I sat up in bed on the computer searching to see if I could find an explanation as to what I saw. Spirit orbs, aliens, angels, demons, no idea. It all seemed like BS to me, but I couldn't logically explain what it was I saw. The following morning I went to Brittany's house. Brittany was my best friend at the time, and I knew she'd believe me. As soon as I told her the story, she asked me to drive her to the cemetery, so I did. We parked in front of the bridge, walked up to the hill and then around the cemetery. We looked for LED lights on tombstones, flashlights, even footprints around the muddy woods, but we didn't see anything that would explain what I saw the night before. The cemetery was also too far away from any major road for it to have been headlights or anything like that. I still don't know what I saw that night, and get goosebumps every time I think about it. If anything, it's helped me keep an open mind about weird stuff that happens.
I currently live in Jersey with my best friend after being kicked out by my mother on Long Island. Me and my friend go back to Long Island frequently, so I can see my old friends. We usually do our spooky route along Long Island, Sweet Hollow Road, Kings Park Psychiatric Center, Stillwell Preserve, personal terrifying experience there, and Cold Spring Harbor. Nothing out of the normal happened. We weren't looking for anything scary. We just used the spooky route as an excuse to drive around. We were calling it a night after we drove around Cold Spring Harbor and put in my friend's address to drive him home. We're following the GPS, and to the left of us is a cemetery. No big deal, until we pass by it, and the entire Mother Mary statue is abnormally lit up, as if it had spotlights all around it. But light only shone from the one right in front of it. The statue almost looked fat, as if Mother Mary and Buddha had a child, and there's two people in front of it. One is kneeling, the other is in front of the statue. Both me and my friend, driving, ask out loud what the hell two people are doing at 12 a.m. in a cemetery standing still. I suggested they were praying, but no answer sat right with us, so we turned around. We parked on the road, cemetery, now to the right of us. I'm closest to it in the passenger's seat. I swear on my life, we yelled at the two people, and what looked to be their clothing froze in mid-air. One of them had something similar to a veil, and it literally froze in mid-air unnaturally after waving as if there was wind. The other had a blanket over them that did the same thing. When they didn't reply, me and my friends got really curious if they were statues, since they didn't look like statues and were in weird positions for statues. We pulled into the parking lot for the cemetery at the front and aimed our headlights at the two figures. I can't explain this part properly, but they morphed through themselves to turn around. They never physically turned around. Their backs phased to their fronts to look at us, and all of us in the car got an overwhelming feeling of dread, evil, and panic. We left promptly, got down the rest of the road we were originally on, except our friend's GPS decided it would be great to reroute us back to the cemetery, which we never put in. We didn't even mark it on the map or anything. We just wanted to get the hell out of there. Even trying to re-enter my friend's address still leads us back to the cemetery. His phone has been messed up with location ever since. We went back to the following week to ask around during the day if maybe they have cult activity or anything paranormal that happens on the grounds. Except the only dude there saw us pull up and locked himself inside the office. We walked up to the Mother Mary statue, which now looks completely normal and not fat or super lit up. Only one light in front of the statue, no other lights around the back or sides. And there were 2 dead spots of grass in the exact spots the figures were. Does anyone have any idea what these entities could have been? I've experienced a lot of things, and so has the driver in this, but both have no idea what they were. They felt purely evil, as if they couldn't even be called demonic, as that would be insulting. It was around 12 a.m. on a full moon, less than 6 months ago, near Cold Spring Harbor. If anyone wanted the address for it, I'd be willing to name it, just to help me figure out this mystery. It keeps me up at night. Every other serious experience I've had hasn't been on this level. I really just want to classify what kind of entity it is, and then avoid them, like the plague.
I live in Central Florida. Since it's a very touristy state, of course towns and other areas like to try and brush over the dark history and even erase it by building on top of it or trying to rewrite the history around it to be harmless. In reality, Florida is the most southern state you get. The Klan, Manifest Destiny, Civil War battles and skirmishes, Native American tribe displacements and eradication, we've had it all. Some of the popular tourist attractions around me, if you ask the right people, will tell the truth of the atrocities that happened there. So yes, it's entirely likely that the majority of this state has some sort of paranormal activity or another. I was in 7th grade at the time, and throughout the year I heard about my friend Bryce, who lived out on the beach in a 4-story house. He had the entire attic/top floor to himself. The beach would be another 250 yards out from his house, and next to his house was an empty lot, followed by an old graveyard and then apartment/housing. The headstones were mostly faced towards the beach, but its entrance was towards the street behind it. I believe this graveyard was one of 2 things, but I can't remember for sure. 1, formerly a slave graveyard from Civil War times that turned into a segregated graveyard until 1909 roughly, or a Native American graveyard from the displacement projects or wars that happened between 1810 and 1850. I personally lean towards the latter, though I've never been able to find out more about this. Bryce had told me that one night he couldn't sleep, and he looked out his window into the pitch-black night to see a set of blue glowing eyes looking at him. I don't know what time of night this was. This had to have likely been because the graveyard was in the process of being built over, laying foundations but just removing the headstones for most of it. Bryce was a bit naive, but I never got the impression from him that he would lie about something like that. I was intrigued and wanted to see this for myself. I finally got the chance on May 14th, 2014, on the last day of true non-exam filled school. We went on a field trip to a local theme park and ended the day having a party on the beach at Bryce's house. During the party, I had made sure to get him to take me over to it from the beach side. He left me for a while. I looked over to it and took out my, for emergencies, hand-me-down phone, a 2010 Samsung T669 Gravity T. I took some pictures on it, as I had seen others do online. I truly regret to this day not just trespass onto it and taking a look at the gravestones remaining, but my 13-year-old self thought that people would care or paying attention. At that age and at that time, the most that would have happened was some nosy neighbor reporting it or getting me grounded. During this time, some people had walked by on the neighborhood streets some ways away, but I'm absolutely sure that no one was there the time I took pictures. I didn't see anything at the time and went about the party. But when I got home and looked over the pictures, I found that one of the three had two people, clear as day, standing near the front gates. From the lower quality images, I could only vaguely make out that they looked like Indians from their form of attire, straight from the Seminole tribe, which was the main tribe fought in Florida during those years previously talked about. I always planned on getting those pictures moved to a different phone over the last 8 years, but never did until a few weeks ago back in November when I remembered that I deleted the third picture back in 2016, seeing nothing and thinking that the other picture showed what I saw. But it appears I was wrong. So now you just have the two taken around 5 p.m. I haven't been able to find anything else about this graveyard other than what Bryce told me in the fall of 2014. And the place had been entirely obliterated by gentrification, leaving an ugly apartment building on top, which he was adamant was haunted. I lost contact with him the following year, so that's a dead end too. I'm not sure what you'll all make of this, but I think about this experience often.
So this happened back in 2019, around November 2nd, I believe. Also, this is 100% true. Not sure if this was just a coincidence or what. So back in 2019, I was pretty much depressed the entire year. Not really suicidal, but let's just say I stopped wearing a seatbelt, smoked twice as many cigarettes as I would have normally, and didn't care much about my well-being for the most part. Due to this depression and things getting worse mentally, I did a lot of dumb things, supernatural-wise. I've always known not to speak to the dead, knowing that when you speak to one spirit, the rest can hear you as well. I've always been extremely superstitious and believe in the paranormal and supernatural 1000%. Anyways, I live next to a huge cemetery and drive by it every day since it's right across from my neighborhood. Due to my superstitions and believing that the dead can do things us humans aren't capable of, each day I would scream out of the window when passing the cemetery, begging for one of the spirits to get me into a car accident. This habit started on November 2nd, I believe, so I did that each day while driving past the cemetery. Lo and behold, November 6th, I was driving to work at about 4:30 a.m. I go the same way every day and was coming up to a red light. Out of nowhere, and I kid you not, this was literally out of nowhere, I heard a loud honk from behind me and was rear-ended by one of those big white trucks that fix telephone poles and stuff. Since I was at the red light, it basically pushed my car forward into the middle of the intersection. And once again, out of nowhere, I was T-boned by some random old man in a van with his wife. I was driving an '05 Nissan Sentra at the time, and it was completely wrecked, literally demolished, and I had not one scratch on me at all. My knees were extremely bruised. I have no idea how that happened, but that was pretty much it. This also happened literally on the main road coming out of my neighborhood, about a mile down from the cemetery. There are never any cars this early in the morning. Maybe one, but even that's rare for the most part. Also, while I was talking to the old man, I found out that they lived in a town literally 40 minutes away and were driving to the park. The whole story is so weird, and it honestly kind of creeps me out. I was in an extremely bad financial situation too, and was stuck without a car for quite a bit. When I was driving by the cemetery begging to be in an accident, I meant that I wanted it to be fatal. So I think whichever spirit heard me or whatever wanted to mess with me or something. I don't know. Take it as you will. Maybe this was just an extremely weird coincidence, but if not, always remember to be careful what you wish for when speaking to the dead.
In 2005, an old high school chum passed away. I thought back on that time and recalled the story, which I shared with his other friends and family, as a sort of belated eulogy. I heard of his passing a while after the service, and wanted people to know that I had fond memories of Brad. When I first met dear Brad, it was the summer of 1974. We were both taking summer school, me because I had to take it to graduate on time, and him just because he wanted to do the summer school musical, You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown. I must admit, it was a fun summer. Bradley got the part of Charlie Brown, and the director, Mr. D, decided to split the cast so that more of the class could have time on stage. So dear Cindy and I alternated playing the part of Lucy. Man, it sure was a real hoot. Mr. Bradley Evans, being the troublemaker he was always saying snotty things about Cindy's voice whenever she sang. She didn't have the most lifting voice, but what she did have was the spirit to stand up there and do the song. I admit that I giggled when he would make the remarks, being a bit of a snot myself. Thank goodness that Cindy was a good sport about it. Yeah, she was a gal with a lot of class and dignity even at 17. So on the last day of the show, the crew party, and after we finished the last ever performance of You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, to be done by the aforementioned cast, we went to the city graveyard. Now I can't exactly say why we decided that would be a good place to go, but that's where we went. I rode in Cindy's car on the way there, and it was a sweet ride. Her daddy owned a car dealership, and she had the latest model. It was white with door-to-door plush carpeting, and the seats were real leather. We all walked around the old graveyard reading some of the names on the tombstones, and I remember laughing at names like Peter Fry. I've heard of French fry, and I've heard of a fried fish, and I've heard of a stir fry, but Peter Fry sounds a bit painful. Of course, no one thought that was funny except Brad and I. We both liked broady humour at the time in our lives, and thought the rest of the kids were L7 squares. Well, whatever, I think it's funny. Then Brad spotted a mausoleum. "Hey!" he exclaimed, "a tomb." Then he proceeded to climb on top, with me not far behind. He was always trying to make fun for himself as well as others, and I knew where Bradley Evans was, fun couldn't be far behind. We climbed atop the tomb, and soon Bruce and Helen joined us, and I think maybe Cindy. We were on the top of this thing, in the middle of a very scary old graveyard, when Brad looks at me, as if expecting something. Maybe a scary story. He had set the scene, and I guess he thought it was my chance to tell one of my stories, as I was always trying to get people to listen to them. And so I began. There's an extremely scary old cemetery in Martinez, where I used to live. It was started back in the early 1800s. I think there are lots of tall monuments and tombs just like this one. Well, one hot, clear summer night, not much different from tonight, some friends and I decided to take a ride up to the old place just to see what would happen. There was an old shack across the road from the graveyard where it was said that the White Witch lived. Anyway, it was all pretty scary to my friends and me, but we really didn't want each other to know, to be branded a coward. So after we parked the car, we hear a god-awful howling sound. It was high-pitched almost to squeal, but we didn't let the horrid noise deter us from entering. We walked around a bit until our eyes became accustomed to the night's dim light. We walked up to a very large tomb and announced, "Let's see what's inside." Well, my best friend Ruby and I slowly walked up behind him, and while holding each other in fright, responded, "Sure, that sounds cool," trying desperately not to sound as if we're both frightened of our little teenage girl minds, because we were. He then proceeded to take out a bolt cutter from a black bag that he had brought along with him. It was at this point I got my very first hint that he may have planned this, but I was too terribly scared to call him out on it. Then suddenly there was a snapping noise, followed by the loud creaking sound of the tomb door being opened. Then a fluttering sound of what seemed like 1,000 wings. Out of the tomb of the front flew a black mass of winged creatures, squeaking as they flew away into the dark night. At that point in the story, I stood up with my arms wide open to dramatize the telling of the events. As I did this, my arm brushed against the branch of a nearby tree. My movement had awakened a sleeping occupant, who then frantically flew just over to Brad's head. He screamed like he was squealing, howling. He frantically jumped off the tomb, ran for Bruce's car, shouting, Bats, they're trying to suck my blood. Well, needless to say, we all jumped off the monument to death and started to follow Brad's example to hit the road. But as soon as I hit the ground, I saw a small bird's nest laying there and realized that the frightened creature had only been a sleeping mother of a sparrow. With the help of Bruce, I placed the nest carefully back in the niche of the tree. I wanted to explain to the frightened group what actually happened, but most of them had already left except for Brad, Bruce, and me. Bruce and I went to the car, where we had a bit of trouble convincing Bradley to open the doors, but eventually he did, and we all drove home in virtual silence. Just before we reached Brad's house, I tried to explain what happened. He said, "I don't want to hear about this night ever again." So we never spoke of the night, from then until now. Although I have, from time to time, pondered in my memory the vision of a frightened giggle. It brings a smile to my heart to remember my dear high school chum Bradley Evans. He shall be sorely missed, and with deepest and respectful heartfelt condolences.
Last year, myself and a good friend went on a haunted road trip of the Midwest. One of our stops was at a place I'd heard about since I was a kid, Dartford Cemetery. It was at night on the 4th of July, and a fireworks show had just ended, leaving the air smelling of sulfur. We parked under a streetlight a little bit down the road from the cemetery to set up our equipment, GoPro, voice recorder, etc. We started on the side of the cemetery that has been known to have the most activity, with a mausoleum and the chief's headstone. After a few minutes of no activity, we start hearing footsteps and see the figure of a person walking towards us in complete darkness. Several moments passed until we crossed paths with this person, but both my friend and I wanted to keep moving past. As we approached the figure, they said, "What are you doing here?" My friend said nothing. "What are you doing here?" No response. To this day, neither of us can agree on this person's age or even their gender. I thought it was a younger man, but my friends saw and heard an elderly woman. Nothing but their voice shows up on our recording. What we both agree on is that this person had abnormally long white limbs. We kept on walking, and the person disappeared from view when we turned around to look. We continued our investigation with the presence of this person in mind, but not in sight. We eventually came across the chief's headstone, where I placed a token of respect to him. When we looked back on the GoPro shortly after this moment, you can hear a hushed, disembodied male voice say, "Run." Since we didn't hear this in real time, we kept moving on towards the center of the cemetery. Out of nowhere, I start hearing footsteps of what seemed a dozen or more people in front of us. When I asked my friend if she heard that, she said she didn't hear a thing. Suddenly, I told her I felt very surrounded, and then we had to leave immediately. We got back to the path and ran all the way to the street where I finally felt we were safe. But it didn't end there. As we walked back to the car, we saw that same person walking on the other side of the street towards us. We crossed the street and avoided eye contact as much as possible. When we were just past them, we turned around briefly, and they had their neck turned all the way around looking at us. We ran to the car, and all the way I was holding the GoPro in order to try and get this on video. Strangely enough, the person did not show up on the recording, even when they were standing under a streetlight. We never saw this person take even a step off the cemetery grounds. Thoroughly spooked, we drove away with an uneasy feeling until we crossed the town line. Something is there. Even if that figure was a real person, I know there are many active entities at that cemetery. Side note, fellow ghost hunters, please remember to be respectful at sites such as these. Leave no trace, reach out politely, and remember, many of these souls have living relatives.
When I was younger, I would always take the shortcut through a local cemetery from my friend's house to my house. I wasn't afraid of it. I knew the caretakers and all the dogs that roamed the place. I get to the middle of the cemetery, and I see candles lit and people standing around. I skirt around them carefully, and as I listen I notice they're all chanting something in Spanish. I'm able to make out a few chickens in a pen, but they're all chanting and praying. I carry on going about my business and make it to my friend's house and think nothing more of it. But the next day I returned on my bike, go to the same spot, and find little bowls filled with chicken eyes and hearts. I was only 17 at the time, but apparently I happened to come upon a group practicing Santeria. It freaked me out so much at first. When I learnt a little more about it, I realized it was not much to fear. Unfortunately, I didn't learn more about it for a few years. It was creepy as hell, especially seeing the remains of the chicken the very next day. Not something you want to remember.
When I was 17, I'm 24 now, I visited a cemetery at night with a small group of friends. We were just going to look at the graves. To give a little love to the graves that looked like maybe no one visited them anymore, because they were from so long ago. We were not going there to hurt anyone or mess around with the graves, because we were, and most of us still are, very spiritual. I'd always liked cemeteries and feel a kind of peace when I'm in one, so I was very comfortable there and relaxed. I think that may be why what happened at all. I was following near the back of the group, lingering on some graves to read what was written when everything, for me, goes blank. The rest of what happens is what my friends told me hours later. "Hey, this one's mine," I called to the nearest person in my group. He turned around to laugh and tell me to quit playing around when he stopped. "I shouldn't have died, really. It wasn't my fault." What do you mean?" he asked, getting my other friends to stop and walk back to me. "Well, you see, I was playing in the barn with the kittens, and the man came in with a gun and bang. I don't think they would have believed I wasn't the one speaking if the voice coming out of me hadn't been so much higher pitched and had a very, very country accent. I don't know why he did it. He was my daddy's best friend." For the next 2 hours, I led them around the cemetery, pointing out graves and telling them about people buried there, like I knew them. One of my friends had her phone out to use as a flashlight and recorded everything I was saying so they could face check when we went back to the house we were staying at. Eventually, I stopped again, frowning at a headstone. "This is my brother. He got to live a long, long time. It's not fair. I wanted to live too," I said, stomping my foot before just collapsing on the ground. I didn't wake up until we got home that night, and I remember I had the worst headache of my whole entire life. My friends showed me the video. Then we all looked up as much as we could on the internet to see if I had been right. I was right about everything, except one thing. The grave I had collapsed on top of hadn't been the brother of the girl who had supposedly possessed me. He had been the son of her father's best friend. The same best friend who she said shot her. I've never been back to that cemetery since. I'm afraid that a little girl won't be the one to possess me this time.
Hey guys, it's Mort here. Thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate you guys hearing the video to the end. I'd like to extend a huge thank you also to my good friend Papa Scare for helping me in tonight's video. If you would like to hear more from him, you can check out the link in the description or the one that will pop up on screen momentarily. Huge thanks as well to my members and patrons whose names are on screen for your continued help and support and contributions. It means the world to me, guys. Thank you so much. And I hope you like your sticker packs when they arrive in the next few weeks, depending on where you live. Haven't actually sent them out because the stickers haven't even arrived, but they will be going out soon. Thanks. But I'm going to wrap things up here. If you want to hear more from Papa Scare, and you definitely should, links are right there now. But anyway, that's it from me, guys. Stay safe, stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.